Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Horizon and watched the stars shift as his ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. This was it, the moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries, first contact with an alien civilization. The year was 2387, and Earth had finally mastered interstellar travel just 5 years ago. Jake felt his heart racing as the sensors picked up massive structures ahead of them. The alien ships were enormous, each one the size of a small city. Their hulls gleamed with a strange blue metal that seemed to pulse with its own light. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying. He opened a communication channel and spoke the words that would change human history forever. "This is Captain Morrison of the Earth vessel USS Horizon. We come in peace and seek peaceful contact with your people." The reply came instantly, the alien voice cold and mechanical through the translation software. "You are humans from the planet designated Earth-Sol 3. You will surrender your vessel and submit to questioning by the Xanthari Empire. Resistance will result in your immediate destruction." Jake felt his blood turn cold. This was not the peaceful first contact humanity had hoped for. The alien who called himself Admiral Vextar informed Jake that humanity was now considered a subject species of the Xanthari Empire. Earth must surrender within 7 standard days or face complete annihilation. Jake tried to negotiate, tried to explain that humanity only wanted peace and friendship among the stars. Admiral Vextar laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Your species is young and weak. You have nothing we want except your submission. Prepare your world for imperial occupation." The USS Horizon raced back to Earth faster than it had ever traveled before. Jake burst into the office of President Lisa Rodriguez with news that would shatter the dreams of 8 billion people. The president was a strong woman who had led humanity through the climate wars of the 2350s, but even she paled when Jake delivered his report. "How many ships do they have?" President Rodriguez asked, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Jake swallowed hard before answering. "Our sensors counted over 3,000 vessels in just the advanced scout fleet, and Admiral Vextar mentioned that was less than 1% of their total military force." President Rodriguez called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Council. Representatives from every nation gathered in the Great Hall beneath New Geneva, their faces grim as they listened to Jake's report. The debate lasted for hours. Some wanted to surrender immediately to save lives. Others demanded that humanity fight no matter the cost. In the end, President Rodriguez made the decision that would define humanity's future. "We cannot surrender our freedom without a fight. We will prepare our defenses and hope for the best." The next 6 days passed like a nightmare. Every military base on Earth and Luna worked around the clock to prepare for invasion. Major Alex Turner supervised the construction of defensive positions around Denver, while Dr. Kate Sullivan worked frantically to evacuate critical research data to underground bunkers. Commander Ryan Brooks took command of the lunar defense stations, knowing they would be the first line of defense against the alien fleet. On the 7th day, they came. The Xanthari invasion fleet appeared at the edge of the solar system like a dark cloud blotting out the stars. There were not 3,000 ships, but 30,000, each one bristling with weapons that could crack planets. At their head flew the massive command vessel of Warlord Kethmar, the Xanthari military commander sent to crush human resistance. The battle for Earth began when the lunar defense stations opened fire. Commander Brooks and his crews fought like heroes, their nuclear missiles and particle beam weapons striking at the alien fleet. For a brief moment, it seemed like humanity might have a chance. Several enemy ships took damage and one small vessel was actually destroyed. Then the Xanthari returned fire. Their plasma cannons vaporized the lunar stations in seconds, turning them into expanding clouds of radioactive gas. Commander Brooks and 3,000 defenders died without even slowing the enemy advance. The way to Earth lay open. Major Turner watched from the ruins of Denver as the first wave of enemy ships entered Earth's atmosphere. The city's defense grid opened fire with everything it had, filling the sky with missiles and laser beams. The weapons struck the alien ships and simply vanished, absorbed by energy shields that flickered blue and gold around each vessel, the Xanthari. Bombardment began 30 minutes after they achieved orbital control. Energy beams lanced down from space, turning entire city blocks into glass. New York, London, Tokyo, and Moscow became furnaces that could be seen from space, Dr. Sullivan huddled in her underground bunker as the ground shook with each impact. Listening to the screams of a dying world through her radio headset, President Rodriguez made her final broadcast from the emergency command center beneath the Rocky Mountains. People of Earth, we have fought as hard as we could, but we cannot win this battle. I am ordering all military units to cease fire and begin evacuation procedures. Save who you can, save what you can, and never forget what they took from us. Today, Admiral Claire Davis received that final order aboard her flagship in the asteroid belt. She had been preparing to lead the reserve fleet in a last desperate charge at the enemy command ship. Instead, she activated Project Exodus, the secret plan to scatter human survivors across the galaxy in hidden colony ships. Her last transmission echoed across human space as the colony ships engaged their drives and vanished into the darkness between stars. Remember what they took from us, remember what we were, and when the time comes, make them pay the battle for. Earth lasted 72 hours. When it ended, 8 billion humans were dead or enslaved. The blue marble that had been humanity's home for 300,000 years now belonged to the Xanthari Empire. They began strip mining operations immediately, tearing apart mountains to extract rare metals for their war machine. But Admiral Davis and her colony ships had escaped into the void, carrying 2 million survivors and the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. The Xanthari believed humanity was broken and scattered. They had no idea that scattered seeds sometimes grow into mighty trees, and that humans had a talent for surviving in impossible places. The war for humanity's freedom had only just begun. 25 years had passed since the fall of Earth, and Colonel Ben Carter stood on the observation deck of New Haven Colony, watching the eternal winter storm rage across the surface of Kepler 442b. The ice world was barely habitable, with surface temperatures that could freeze a human solid in minutes, but it was home to 50,000 survivors who had learned to make impossible places livable. Ben remembered the day their colony ship had arrived at this frozen wasteland. Most of the refugees had cried when they saw their new home, a ball of ice and rock orbiting a dim red star, but Ben had smiled. The Xanthari would never look for humans on a world like this, and humans had always been good at surviving where others could not. The colony existed entirely underground, carved into the bedrock beneath miles of ice. Geothermal vents provided power and heat, while vast hydroponic farms grew in chambers lit by artificial suns. Dr. Amy Foster had developed new techniques for growing food in the low gravity and harsh conditions, creating hybrid crops that could feed the entire population. Ben walked through the main corridor of the colony, past the workshops where engineers built tools from scavenged materials and the schools where children learned about the Earth they would never see. These kids had been born on Kepler 442b, but they still called themselves humans and dreamed of the day they would reclaim their birthright. In the communications center, Nicole Wright monitored the quantum relay that connected New Haven to the other scattered human colonies. 27 settlements had survived the exodus, hidden on worlds the Xanthari considered worthless. Each colony checked in once a week with coded messages that reported their status and shared vital information. The message from Proxima 7 made Ben smile. Engineer Sam Phillips had achieved another breakthrough in reverse engineering Xanthari technology. His team had successfully replicated the energy matrix from a captured shield generator, though they still could not produce the exotic materials needed to build a full-sized unit. Sam worked in a converted mining facility on the desert world of Proxima 7, where temperatures during the day could melt steel and nighttime brought cold that could shatter stone. His colony of 15,000 survivors had built their settlement in underground caves, connected by tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the sand. The captured Xanthari equipment had come from a supply convoy that Captain John Hayes had attacked 6 months ago. John commanded a small fleet of converted civilian ships that struck at enemy cargo vessels in the outer systems. His tactics were simple but effective: hit fast and hard, then vanish into the asteroid fields before the enemy could respond. John stood on the bridge of his flagship, a former passenger liner that had been converted into a stealth attack ship. His crew of 300 volunteers came from a dozen different colonies, all united by their hatred of the Xanthari and their determination to make the enemy pay for what they had done to Earth. The intelligence reports from Greg Martin painted a picture of an empire that was vast but overextended. Greg had spent 20 years mapping Xanthari patrol routes and identifying weak points in their defensive networks. His data showed that the empire controlled over 1,000 worlds, but their military was spread thin across countless sectors. What gave the humans hope was the evidence that the Xanthari were not popular rulers. Intelligence officer Maria Santos worked on Earth itself, organizing resistance networks among the enslaved human population. Her report spoke of growing unrest among other conquered species who were tired of Xanthari oppression. Maria moved through the ruins of New York like a ghost, using the underground tunnels and hidden passages that honeycombed the city. The Xanthari had rebuilt the surface as an administrative center, but they paid little attention to the basement levels where human slaves lived and worked. It was there that Maria recruited agents and gathered information about enemy troop movements. The resistance on Earth was dangerous work. The Xanthari showed no mercy to rebels, and public executions were common. But Maria had built a network of brave men and women who risked their lives to smuggle information off-world through sympathetic alien traders. These traders belonged to species that had been conquered by the Xanthari centuries ago and still remembered what freedom felt like. The most valuable intelligence came from intercepted Xanthari communications. Greg Martin had learned to decode their military frequencies, giving the human colonies advance warning of patrol schedules and supply convoys. This information allowed Captain John Hayes to plan his raids with precision, striking when enemy defenses were weakest. One of John's most successful attacks had targeted a Xanthari research station in the Vega system. His ships had destroyed the facility and captured several enemy scientists, along with their research data on human psychology and biology. The data revealed that the Xanthari had been studying their human slaves, trying to understand what made them so difficult to break. The research notes contained a disturbing revelation. Every species the Xanthari had conquered had eventually submitted completely, their populations becoming docile and obedient within a few generations. But humans were different. Even after 25 years of slavery, they still fought back, still dreamed of freedom, still passed their anger down to their children. Dr. Amy Foster found this information fascinating from a scientific perspective. Her studies of human survivors across the colonies showed remarkable adaptability to extreme environments. Humans on ice worlds developed better cold resistance, while those on desert planets showed improved heat tolerance. The species was evolving in real time, becoming stronger and more resilient with each generation. The colonies had also begun developing their own culture, distinct from Earth but still recognizably human. Children learned songs about the old world and stories about heroes, like Admiral Davis, who had saved them from extinction. They also learned practical skills like weapons maintenance and guerrilla warfare tactics, preparing for the day when humanity would strike back. Colonel Ben Carter received regular reports from all the colonies, and the picture they painted was encouraging. The population was growing steadily, with a new generation of humans who had never known defeat. These young people were harder and more determined than their parents, raised on stories of Xanthari atrocities and burning with desire for revenge. The scattered colonies were also beginning to coordinate their efforts. Nicole Wright had established secure communication links that allowed real-time coordination between settlements. When Captain John Hayes planned a major raid, colonies across the galaxy could provide intelligence and support. The breakthrough came when Sam Phillips successfully reverse-engineered a Xanthari computer core. The device contained detailed schematics for enemy weapons and ship designs, information that could level the playing field in future battles. Copies of the data were transmitted to every colony, where engineers began working on countermeasures. And improved weapons, General Tony Rodriguez had emerged as the unofficial leader of the human diaspora. The former president's brother had been aboard one of the colony ships during the Exodus, and his natural leadership skills had made him the coordinator of military operations across all settlements. Tony understood that scattered resistance efforts were not enough. Humanity needed a unified strategy and the resources to carry it out. The plan that emerged from months of secret communications between colonies was ambitious and dangerous. Instead of random raids and sabotage, the humans would begin a coordinated campaign to weaken Xanthori control across multiple sectors simultaneously. The goal was not just to survive, but to create enough chaos that other enslaved species would begin to rebel. As Colonel Ben Carter watched the storm rage outside New Haven Colony, he thought about the message he had received that morning from General Rodriguez. The time for hiding was almost over. Soon, humanity would announce to the galaxy that they had not forgotten what was taken from them. The scattered seeds of Earth were about to bloom into something the Xanthari Empire had never faced before. A species that grew stronger through adversity and never stopped fighting for freedom. General Tony Rodriguez stood in the command center hidden deep within the Kepler Nebula, watching holographic displays that showed the positions of human forces scattered across dozens of star systems. The nebula was a perfect hiding place for the resistance base. Its swirling gases and electromagnetic storms made it impossible for Xanthari sensors to penetrate, but human ships could navigate its dangers using specially modified drives. 5 years had passed since the scattered colonies had begun coordinating their efforts, and the transformation was remarkable. What had started as desperate groups of survivors had evolved into a sophisticated military organization. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell coordinated intelligence operations from dozens of sectors, while Chief Engineer Paul Clark supervised the production of weapons specifically designed to counter Xanthari technology. The mobile command base was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, its chambers carved from solid rock and lined with equipment salvaged from a dozen different worlds. The facility housed 3,000 people, including the best scientists, engineers, and military tacticians from all the human colonies. They had turned this floating rock into the beating heart of the resistance. Paul Clark walked through the manufacturing section, inspecting the latest batch of pulse rifles his teams had produced. These weapons used technology reverse-engineered from captured Xanthari equipment, but with improvements that made them more effective against enemy shields. The humans had discovered that rapid-fire bursts could overload Xanthari defensive systems, a weakness the aliens had never bothered to fix. Because no other species had been creative enough to exploit it, the Resistance had made disturbing discoveries about the nature of the Xanthari Empire through analysis of captured data cores. Dr. Helen Price, the chief biologist, had studied genetic samples from dozens of conquered species and found a horrifying pattern. The Xanthari had been systematically destroying the cultures and identities of their subject peoples for over 1,000 years. Each conquered species followed the same trajectory. First came military defeat and occupation, then economic exploitation, as the Xanthari stripped worlds of their resources. Finally came cultural assimilation, as children were taken from their families and raised as loyal imperial citizens. Within 3 or 4 generations, most species forgot they had ever been free, but humans were proving to be different in ways that puzzled both the resistance scientists and their Xanthari enemies. Captain Mike Johnson had led several raids on enemy research facilities and discovered that imperial scientists were baffled by human behavior. Every other species had shown predictable responses to conquest and occupation, but humans continued to resist even after decades of slavery. The biological studies conducted by Dr. Price revealed why humans were so resilient. Human physiology was remarkably adaptable compared to most galactic species. Where other beings required specific environmental conditions to survive, humans could thrive in almost any habitat with minimal technological support. More importantly, Human brain chemistry seemed to resist the psychological conditioning that had broken other species. This resilience had become the foundation of Operation Nightfall, a coordinated campaign of sabotage and disruption across Centauri. Space. Teams of specialists led by experts like demolitions expert Chris Adams targeted critical infrastructure throughout the Empire. Communication relays, mining operations, supply depots, and administrative centers all became targets for human saboteurs. Chris Adams crouched in the maintenance tunnel beneath a Centauri command post on the world of Rigel 4, carefully placing shaped charges around the power conduits that fed the facility's defense systems. His team had spent 3 weeks infiltrating the installation, disguised as maintenance workers from a subjugated species that looked similar to humans with the right genetic modifications. The beauty of Operation Nightfall was its scope and coordination. While Chris planted his explosives on Rigel 4, similar teams were conducting simultaneous operations on 17 other worlds. At exactly the same moment, relay stations across 3 sectors would go dark, mining operations would halt, and supply lines would be severed. The Centauri would wake up to find their empire bleeding from 100 small wounds. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. For the first time in centuries, the Centauri Empire was facing an enemy that could strike anywhere without warning. Commander Lisa Turner, who had grown up in the Resistance and never known peace, specialized in hit-and-run tactics that left enemy commanders paranoid and uncertain. Lisa led her strike team through the corridors of a Centauri transport ship, their magnetic boots allowing them to move in zero gravity while the crew struggled with a sudden loss of artificial gravity. Her people moved with the efficiency of predators, stunning guards and planting tracking devices that would allow the Resistance to monitor enemy ship movements. The intelligence gathered from these operations was priceless. The Resistance learned about Centauri military doctrine, their communication protocols, and most importantly, their blind spots. The Empire had grown complacent after centuries of easy victories, and their security procedures were designed to prevent uprising by broken slave populations, not infiltration by sophisticated guerrilla forces. General Rodriguez studied the intelligence reports in his command chamber, noting patterns that revealed the Empire's weaknesses. The Centauri military was powerful but inflexible, designed for massive conventional battles rather than the asymmetric warfare the humans were conducting. Their commanders followed rigid protocols that made their responses predictable to anyone who understood their thinking. The real breakthrough came when Commander Frank Lewis successfully infiltrated a Centauri research facility and stole complete technical specifications for their shield generators and weapons systems. The data revealed not just how the technology worked, but why it worked, giving human scientists the information they needed to develop effective countermeasures. Dr. Helen Price worked with a team of engineers to analyze the stolen specifications, looking for vulnerabilities that human weapons could exploit. They discovered that Centauri shields operated on specific frequency ranges that could be disrupted by precisely tuned electromagnetic pulses. More importantly, the shield generators had built safety protocols that could be hacked and turned against their operators. The information transformed human military capabilities almost overnight. Chief Engineer Clark began producing new weapons and defensive systems based on the stolen technology, while specialized teams practiced the techniques needed to exploit Centauri vulnerabilities. For the first time since the fall of Earth, humans would enter battle with technological advantages over their enemies. The Empire's response to the increasing attacks was predictably brutal. Imperial forces increased security on occupied worlds and began executing suspected collaborators in public displays meant to terrorize the population. But the harsh measures only drove more species to secretly support the human cause, creating an underground network that spanned dozens of systems. Agent Tracy Adams worked to coordinate this growing network of sympathetic aliens, many of whom belonged to species that had been conquered generations ago, but still remembered stories of freedom passed down through their families. These beings provided safe houses, forged documents, and intelligence about Centauri operations, In exchange for human technology and the promise that liberation might be possible, the resistance had grown from scattered survivors into a force that could challenge the Empire directly. General Rodriguez authorized the next phase of operations, shifting from sabotage to open warfare. The target was carefully chosen, a fortress world called Zarian Prime that served as the regional command center for 3 entire sectors. Zarian Prime was considered impregnable by Xanthari military doctrine. The planet was surrounded by orbital defense platforms and defended by over 1 million troops. Its capture would send shockwaves across the galaxy and prove that no Xanthari stronghold was safe from human determination. As General Rodriguez studied the tactical plans for the assault on Zarian Prime, he thought about Admiral Davis and her final message before the colony ships had scattered into the void. She had told them to remember what was taken from them and to make the enemy pay when the time came. That time was approaching fast, and humanity was ready to collect the debt the Xanthari Empire owed them. Dr. Robert Kim stood in his laboratory aboard the Resistance Command Base, studying the holographic display that showed the complete technical specifications of Xanthari shield technology. The stolen data from the enemy research facility had given humanity its most dangerous weapon yet, complete understanding of how their oppressors' defenses worked. For 30 years, those shields had made Xanthari ships and installations nearly invulnerable, but now Kim's team had found ways to make them useless. The breakthrough had come when Kim discovered that Xanthari shields operated by creating a harmonic resonance field around their targets. The field absorbed incoming energy by converting it to heat and dispersing it through specially designed vents. But like all resonance systems, it could be disrupted if you knew the right frequency to use. Admiral Kevin Walsh reviewed the tactical plans for Operation Prometheus in his ready room, the assault on Zarian Prime that would test every innovation humanity had developed during 3 decades of guerrilla warfare. The fortress world was protected by defenses that had never been breached, but Walsh believed his forces could succeed where every other species had failed. The operation would require precise coordination between dozens of resistance cells across multiple star systems. Each team had a specific role to play in the complex dance that would either liberate a Xanthari stronghold or result in the destruction of the human fleet. Walsh had learned military strategy from studying the mistakes of Earth's defenders, and he was determined not to repeat their errors. General Rodriguez gave his final approval for the mission during a secure communication with colony leaders across the galaxy. The decision had not been easy, as failure would cripple the resistance and expose the location of human settlements to Xanthari retaliation. But Rodriguez understood that the time for hiding was over, and humanity needed a victory that would inspire other enslaved species to join their cause. Commander Frank Lewis prepared his stealth ships for the first phase of the assault, the infiltration of Zarian Prime's outer defense perimeter. His vessels had been modified with captured Xanthari identification codes and holographic projectors that could disguise them as routine supply transports. The deception would only work for a few hours, but that should be enough time to reach their targets. Frank's team consisted of volunteers from 6 different human colonies, each one an expert in stealth operations and sabotage. They had trained for months in simulators built from captured Xanthari equipment, learning to move through enemy installations without triggering security systems. Their mission was to disable the orbital sensor platforms that protected Zarian Prime from surprise attack. The fortress world hung in space like a jewel of death, its surface covered with military installations and weapons emplacements. The orbit platforms that surrounded it were marvels of Xanthari engineering, each one capable of destroying entire fleets with their plasma cannons and particle beam arrays, but they depended on a network of sensors and communication relays to coordinate their fire, and those systems could be sabotaged by humans who understood their weaknesses. Agent Tracy Adams led the infiltration teams that had been placed on Zarian Prime months earlier, disguised as workers from various subjugated species. Her people had spent weeks mapping the underground tunnel systems that connected the planet's major installations, identifying weak points where explosives could cause maximum damage to enemy defenses, Tracy moved through the service tunnels beneath the main command bunker, her team following in single file as they approached their primary target. The facility's power grid was controlled from a central distribution center that fed energy to every defensive system on the planet. If they could overload the grid at the right moment, the planet's shields and weapons would be defenseless for several critical minutes. The assault began exactly at 0800 hours, Galactic Standard Time, when Commander Lewis's stealth ships reached their designated positions around the orbital platforms. The humans had developed electromagnetic pulse devices specifically designed to overload Xanthari sensor arrays, and they planted these weapons with surgical precision on 12 different platforms. Engineer Sam Phillips had perfected skip drive, technology that allowed human ships to make precise micro-jumps past enemy shield barriers. His breakthrough had come from studying the quantum mechanics of Xanthari faster-than-light travel, discovering that their shields were designed to stop conventional attacks, but could be bypassed by ships that materialized inside the protected zone. Captain Stephen Moore commanded the first human battle fleet to engage Xanthari forces in direct combat since Earth's fall 43 years earlier. His ships were smaller than the enemy vessels but faster and more maneuverable, using tactics developed through decades of hit-and-run raids to strike where the Xanthari were weakest. The Battle of Zarian Prime began when the orbital sensors went dark, blinded by the electromagnetic pulse devices that Frank Lewis had planted. For the first time in centuries, a Xanthari fortress world was vulnerable to surprise attack, and the human fleet materialized inside the defensive perimeter using skip drive technology that the enemy had never encountered before. Moore's ships struck like lightning, their weapons targeting the specific frequencies that Dr. Kim had identified as vulnerable points in Xanthari shield technology. The first enemy platform exploded in a cascade of secondary detonations as its shields failed, and its reactor went critical. The psychological impact on the Xanthari defenders was enormous. As they had never seen their technology defeated so completely, the battle raged for 18 hours as human forces used every advantage they had developed through years of careful study and preparation. Skip drives allowed them to appear behind enemy lines, while their weapons disrupted Xanthari shields with precisely tuned electromagnetic pulses. Most importantly, their tactics were unpredictable and creative in ways that confused enemy artificial intelligence systems. Major Dan Cooper led the ground assault when the orbital defenses finally fell, his troops landing in specially modified dropships that could penetrate the planet's atmosphere at speeds that made them nearly impossible to intercept. His soldiers wore powered armor reverse-engineered from captured Xanthari equipment, but improved with human innovations that made them more effective in combat. The fighting on the surface was fierce but brief. Xanthari ground forces were trained to fight other aliens who followed predictable military doctrines, but humans used irregular tactics that had been developed in the colonies where survival depended on thinking differently than everyone else. Cooper's troops moved through the enemy installations like smoke, striking from unexpected directions and vanishing before the defenders could respond effectively. The liberation of Zarian Prime's slave populations was the most emotionally powerful moment of the battle. Dr. Amy Foster worked with medical teams to treat beings who had been imprisoned for generations, many of whom had never seen the surface of their own world. The freed slaves came from dozens of different species, but they all looked at their human liberators with the same expression of amazement and hope. The strategic impact of the victory was immediate and profound. For the first time in over 1,000 years, a major Xanthari fortress world had fallen to enemy attack. The humans had captured intact command facilities containing detailed intelligence about the entire Imperial structure, including the locations of other fortress worlds and the deployment of enemy fleets. More importantly, the victory proved that Xanthari technology was not invincible when faced with opponents who understood its weaknesses. News of the battle spread across the galaxy through underground communication networks, inspiring enslaved species on dozens of worlds to begin planning their own uprisings. General Rodriguez received reports from resistance cells throughout the Empire describing increased recruitment and more aggressive sabotage operations. The fall of Zarian Prime had given the galaxy's oppressed peoples something they had not felt in centuries: hope that the Xanthari Empire could be defeated and freedom could be restored. Admiral Walsh began planning the next phase of operations. From his new headquarters on liberated Zarian Prime, using the captured intelligence to identify targets throughout Xanthari space. The Resistance now had a secure base of operations in enemy territory and the resources to sustain a major military campaign. The war had entered a new phase. Humanity was no longer fighting merely for survival, but for the complete liberation of every world under Xanthari control. The scattered seeds that Admiral Davis had planted in the darkness were beginning to bear fruit, and the harvest would reshape the balance of power across the entire galaxy. Emperor Zethkal stood in the war room of his palace on the Xanthari homeworld, staring at tactical displays that showed the extent of the human rebellion spreading across his empire. The fall of Zarian Prime had shattered 1,000 years of imperial invincibility, and now uprisings were breaking out on dozens of worlds. For the first time in his long reign, the Emperor felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The humans had done something no other species had ever accomplished. They had not only survived conquest and slavery, they had grown stronger through adversity. The scattered refugees who had fled Earth 43 years ago had transformed into a military force capable of challenging the greatest empire in galactic history. Admiral Kreshver received his orders directly from the Emperor himself: the complete eradication of the human species and any world that had harbored human refugees. Protocol Omega had never been implemented in the Empire's history, as it violated basic principles of imperial doctrine about the value of subject populations. But the humans had proven that some species were too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The Xanthari response was swift and merciless. Kreshver led a massive fleet of over 5,000 warships in a campaign of systematic extermination that targeted every known human colony. The Empire abandoned its usual policy of conquest and resource extraction, instead using antimatter weapons to sterilize entire star systems where humans might be hiding. The first target was the agricultural colony on Kepler 186f, home to 30,000 humans who had spent decades turning a barren world into a garden. Colonel Patricia Hughes coordinated the evacuation as Xanthari ships appeared at the edge of the system, but there was not enough time to save everyone. The planet died in a flash of antimatter fire that could be seen from neighboring systems. Dr. Jennifer Lewis watched from the bridge of an evacuation ship as the world where she had been born vanished in a burst of nuclear fusion. She was humanity's chief diplomat now, tasked with the impossible job of negotiating military alliances with alien species who had their own reasons to fear Xanthari retaliation. The destruction of Kepler 186f had given her powerful evidence of imperial brutality, but it had cost 30,000 human lives. The Altarian Federation was the first major power to openly support the human cause. Their ambassador, a tall being with crystalline skin and multiple arms, met with Dr. Lewis in a secret location to discuss military cooperation. The Altarians had been neutral in galactic politics for centuries, but the sight of Xanthari forces committing genocide had convinced them that neutrality was no longer possible. The vegan trade consortium joined the alliance after Xanthari forces destroyed one of their merchant fleets for the crime of providing supplies to human refugees. The consortium controlled dozens of important trade routes and had the economic power to fund a major military campaign. More importantly, they had connections with smuggling networks that could move weapons and supplies throughout the galaxy without detection. General Rodriguez faced the greatest challenge of his career as he tried to coordinate a coalition of dozens of different species, each with their own military traditions and political agendas. The headquarters on Zarian Prime had become a babel of alien languages as representatives from across the galaxy gathered to plan the overthrow of the Xanthari Empire. Intelligence Chief Marcus Stone worked around the clock to prevent Imperial agents from infiltrating the Alliance. The Xanthari had centuries of experience in breaking apart coalitions through bribery, assassination, and political manipulation. Stone's teams used human-developed security techniques to protect Alliance leaders, But the constant threat of betrayal made military planning extremely difficult. The humans implemented a new strategy called the Hydra Protocol to deal with the Empire's systematic attacks on their leadership. Instead of centralized command structures, resistance cells operated with complete autonomy, making decisions based on local conditions and predetermined guidelines. When the Xanthari destroyed one command center, 3 more emerged to replace it. Captain Rebecca Allen commanded human forces during the Battle of the Spiral Nebula, where the Allied fleet achieved its first major victory against the Imperial main battle force. The engagement demonstrated that Xanthari ships, while individually superior, could not adapt to the combined tactical innovations of multiple species working in coordination. Rebecca's ships used skip drive technology to appear inside the enemy formation, while Altarian vessels provided long-range fire support with weapons that could penetrate Xanthari shields. Vegan ships served as mobile command platforms, coordinating the battle through quantum communication networks that the Empire could not jam or intercept. The victory at Spiral Nebula cost the Xanthari over 300 warships and exposed critical weaknesses in their battle doctrine. Imperial commanders had been trained to fight enemies who used conventional tactics, but the Alliance forces employed strategies that combined the military traditions of dozens of different species. Colonel Patricia Hughes led a joint task force that liberated the mining world of Rigel 7, freeing over 2 million slaves from a dozen different species. The operation required precise coordination between human stealth teams, Altarian assault forces, and vegan support ships. The success demonstrated that the Alliance could conduct complex military operations despite the challenges of multi-species cooperation. The liberation of slave populations became a crucial part of Alliance strategy. Each freed world provided new recruits and resources for the war effort, while also serving as proof that Admiral Claire Davis stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty, the massive human dreadnought that would lead the final assault on the Xanthari homeworld. At 73 years old, she was one of the last surviving veterans of the fall of Earth, and she had waited nearly half a century for this moment. The woman who had saved humanity by scattering the colony ships into the void had returned to finish what the Xanthari had started. The Allied fleet that gathered in the outer system was the largest armada in galactic history. Ships from 47 different species filled space for millions of kilometers, their combined firepower capable of cracking planets and destroying entire solar systems. But this would not be a battle of simple destruction. It would be a surgical strike designed to topple an empire, while preserving the galaxy for those who would inherit it. Chief Science Officer Andrew Parker oversaw the weapon systems that combined human innovation with technologies from across the galaxy. The USS Liberty carried armaments that could shatter moons and defensive shields that had never been penetrated by enemy fire. But the ship's greatest weapon was its crew, humans who had grown up in exile and trained their entire lives for this single battle. The Xanthari homeworld hung before them like a dark jewel surrounded by layers of artificial defenses. Orbital battle stations the size of cities protected the planet's surface, while energy barriers that could deflect entire fleets shimmered in the void. Emperor Zethkal had turned his homeworld into the ultimate fortress, a trap designed to destroy any force foolish enough to attack it. Captain Jake Morrison, the same explorer who had made first contact with the Xanthari 50 years earlier, commanded the assault force that would penetrate the planet's defenses. His hair was gray now and his face lined with the years of war, but his determination burned as bright as ever. He had been there when humanity first encountered the Empire, and he would be there when it fell. The siege of the Xanthari homeworld lasted 6 months, as Allied forces systematically dismantled the planet's defensive systems. Human skip drives allowed strike teams to appear inside the orbital fortresses, while Altarian siege engines bombarded the energy barriers with weapons that could tear apart the fabric of space itself. General Rodriguez coordinated the ground assault from his command ship, watching as landing craft descended through the planet's atmosphere toward the Imperial capital. The city was a marvel of alien architecture, its towers reaching into the clouds and its streets paved with metals taken from 1,000 conquered worlds. But soon it would be just another liberated city in a free galaxy, Admiral Walsh commanded. The orbital bombardment, his ships targeting military installations with surgical precision. The goal was not to destroy the planet, but to force the surrender of the imperial government. Every shot was calculated to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing psychological pressure on the enemy leadership. The final assault on the Imperial Palace was led by Jake Morrison himself, his strike team fighting through corridors lined with the treasures of extinct civilizations. The Xanthari had decorated their seat of power with trophies taken from every species they had conquered, but those artifacts would soon be returned to their rightful heirs. Emperor Zethkal made his last stand in the throne room where countless species had been sentenced to slavery or extinction. The chamber was vast, its walls covered with holographic displays showing the collapse of his empire. Rebellions burned on every remaining Xanthari world as news of the homeworld assault spread across the galaxy. The Emperor was not the massive, terrifying figure that Jake had expected. He was simply an old alien who had lived too long and seen his life's work crumble into dust. When Jake entered the throne room, Zethkal was alone except for a handful of guards who laid down their weapons rather than die for a lost cause. The battle between Jake and the Emperor was brief but symbolic. Two representatives of their species facing each other in single combat that would determine the fate of the galaxy. When Zethkal fell, the Xanthari Empire died with him. Its 1,000-year reign of terror finally brought to an end. The collapse of imperial authority was swift and complete. Within days of the Emperor's death, Xanthari commanders across the galaxy began surrendering to Alliance forces. Some worlds continued fighting until their populations rose up against their own leaders. But most recognized that the war was over and further resistance was pointless. President Amanda White presided over the establishment of the new Galactic Federation from the liberated Earth, the blue world that had been humanity's birthright for 300,000 years. The planet bore scars from decades of strip mining and industrial exploitation, but it was healing under the care of humans who had never forgotten their true home. The new federation was built on principles that the Xanthari had never understood: voluntary association and mutual defense rather than conquest and domination. Former Xanthari territories were granted independence, while species that chose to join the Federation did so as equal partners with full representation in the Galactic Council. Dr. Jennifer Lewis served as the Federation's first Secretary General, her experience in managing the wartime alliance making her the natural choice to oversee the transition to peace. Her first act was to establish the War Crimes Tribunal that would judge those responsible for imperial atrocities, ensuring that justice was served while also offering reconciliation to those who sought it. The ceremony marking the official end of the war took place in the ruins of New York, where humanity's long journey had begun with Admiral Davis's final transmission. Representatives from hundreds of worlds gathered to sign the Charter of Galactic Freedom, the document that would govern relations between species for generations to come. General Rodriguez, Admiral Davis, and the other surviving leaders of the human resistance watched as children from dozens of different species played together in what had once been the Xanthari Administrative Center. Above them, construction crews worked to rebuild the city not as it had been, but as something better, a symbol of cooperation rather than domination. The memorial wall that was erected in Central Park listed the names of every human who had died in the struggle for freedom. At the top, carved in letters that could be seen from orbit, were Admiral Davis's final words from Earth's last battle: "Remember what they took from us. Remember what we were, and when the time comes, make them pay." Humanity had kept that promise in ways that even Admiral Davis could never have imagined. They had not simply defeated their oppressors, they had transformed the nature of galactic civilization itself. The scattered seeds that had been planted in desperation had grown into something magnificent, a federation based on freedom rather than fear. Jake Morrison stood before the memorial as the sun set over the restored Earth, thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Humanity had lost their world but gained something far greater in return. They had become the liberators of the galaxy, the species that proved tyranny could be defeated and freedom could triumph over any oppression. The humans had taken the empire that had taken their world, and in doing so they had given every species in the galaxy something precious beyond measure. They had given them hope for a future where the strong protected the weak, where diversity was celebrated rather than crushed, and where no species would ever again face extinction at the hands of those who believed might made right. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. Humanity would spend the next century helping to rebuild the galaxy, sharing the knowledge and values they had learned during their long exile. The children playing in the ruins of New York would grow up in a universe where freedom was not just a dream but a birthright, protected by those who remembered the cost of losing it.